From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Thank you for joining the McLaughlin Group, a show where friends disagree agreeably. I'm Tom Rogan. This week's panelists are, filling in for Pat Buchanan, editor of The American Conservative Jim Antle, columnist Eleanor Clift of The Daily Beast, columnist Clarence Page of The Chicago Tribune, and conservative commentator Shermichael Singleton. Okay, let's get to issue 1. The Senate deliberates.
It is a dangerous moment, but we're not trying to rush through this trial. We're actually trying to have a real trial here.
Democrats and Republicans exchanged sharp words as the impeachment trial of President Trump got underway this week. More ominous for the nation's increasingly divisive political discourse, Chief Justice John Roberts had to warn senators, Trump's legal team, and Democratic impeachment managers to embrace civility.
Jim, there wasn't much civility in the Senate this week, but What do you see as the top-line takeaway from the first week of the trial?
Well, I think that the main focus, given that it looks like that there's a core nucleus of about 40 to 45 Republicans who dismiss the articles of impeachment, which suggests that there is no likelihood of the president's removal. So the question is, number one, can they make the votes on procedure and witnesses uncomfortable for any swing state Republicans who are up for re-election this year? Does this become difficult for a Cory Gardner? Does this become difficult for a Susan Collins? And then after that, the question is, can you peel some Republicans off who have a variety of other interests, whether they're maybe never-Trumpers like Mitt Romney, whether they're retiring Republicans who are looking more toward history than fearing Trump tweets or the Republican base. Can they get any of them to vote with the Democrats on accepting new witnesses, accepting new documents, to make the trial as damaging politically as possible for the president, and also to potentially move the needle in public opinion in some way?
Eleanor.
Well, Adam Schiff, who you showed in that clip, did a masterful job outlining the case against the president. And the Republicans are basically saying, well, it's repetitive and it's boring, but it's quite clear that the facts that are involved in those 2 impeachment articles are a slam-shut case against the president, that he did what he did in pressuring an American ally to find dirt on a potential political rival in service of his own future as opposed to the national security of this country. It's clear the Republicans don't care. They have voted down witnesses' testimony that could embellish the case, and it's clear the president's not going to be removed. But I think the message has gotten across that this is a rigged process, that the Republicans don't want to see any additional testimony. They don't want any of the president's supporters, and they were people in his administration, to testify. And when you have 70% of the American public saying, yes, we do want to see witnesses, I think that puts an asterisk next to the president's potential acquittal that could have repercussions in November.
Right.
I mean, look, I think Democrats had an opportunity to request witnesses on the House side. It would have taken a lot longer. They would have had to go through the arduous process of going through the court system. They did not want to do that. They chose to rush this process. When you look at the viewership, the percentage of Americans that are actually watching this trial in comparison to the number of households that actually have televisions within their homes, the numbers are abysmal. Americans just are not paying attention to this. And if I were Democrats, what would concern me most is that they're in the middle of a Democratic primary. You have, several of their top candidates sitting in this process and not campaigning in places like Iowa, New Hampshire, possibly even South Carolina, which arguably could lead to them choosing a nominee that a majority of their base does not want, which again would benefit President Trump and Republicans come November. And so I think Democrats, if they were smart, they should have taken their time. They should not have rushed this process. I would argue several months from now, there will be some other major political issue or scandal in the country, and voters writ large will have moved on from this.
Clarence.
Well, sure, Michael, I'm delighted to hear you express so much concern for the Democratic campaign over there. You know, I assure you the Democratic candidates are doing just fine, frankly. But what's interesting to me is how many senators haven't been following this whole controversy. You know, it's not just the public out here. Somebody, I forget who was being interviewed the other day, one member saying that a lot of them had found out information they weren't aware of before, and which most of us would know if we watched cable news. But it's well, it depends on which cable news channel, I should point out as well. No, I think while it's true that the president is unlikely to be unseated because of the numbers right now, there has been a public education process that is going on here for everybody. This has been. I think it's important that somebody hold up some lamp of decency and concern for the rules and concern for the institution. This time, it's the Democrats who have that task, just as it was Republicans who had it in the days of the Lewinsky scandal.
Is there a challenge, Eleanor, that Show Michael notes that it seems to be the Democratic base that is most mobilized on this issue? Other Americans are sort of turning off. How do you think Democrats, let's say President Trump is not convicted, how do Democrats draw the connection point from the evidence they've produced to the broader electoral question of perhaps you do not want to re-elect this man? I mean, what is that argument, do you think, for that?
I have to resist to want to refute everything that Sir Michael says. The Democrats didn't call or subpoena witnesses in the House. They actually subpoenaed several. And Don McGahn was one of them, a former White House counsel. And the judge ruled that, yes, he did need to appear. They are now appealing it, and we won't hear from that for some time. The president ordered everyone to not speak. He didn't turn over a single document. He completely stonewalled. They were going to run the clock out. So to say, oh, the House Democrats are rushing it, that is not the case at all. And I think the point that the Democrats have to make is that this is a president who is trying, they use the word cheat. He's trying to cheat to win re-election. This is a pure power struggle. He is willing to do anything to get himself reelected, and acquittal is likely to just embolden him. But it's now out in the public, and I think people are paying attention. I don't know what numbers you're citing. Nobody is sitting and spending 10 hours in front of their television. But some of us, but any time you turn it on, I would think Fiona Hill should be getting royalties. I've heard.
Right.
And she's very compelling.
So Show Michael, I asked Eleanor, though, how do Democrats draw that electoral connection point? How do Republicans refute that? How do they say
it's very easy. I mean, I think Republicans' messaging on our side is simple. From the day one that Donald Trump was elected, you had several very prominent Democrats in the House of Representatives that immediately said he must be impeached. This was before anything that some may perceive as being antithetical to the office. And so I think there's an easy case to make to the Republican base that they're doing this solely because they dislike the president. But to your original question to Eleanor about how do Democrats turn this message into mobilizing once the president is acquitted, because he will be acquitted, I'm not certain that they can for their ardent base. And I also think another issue that Democrats have is the Bernie Sanders problem. What happens if Sanders is not nominated? What happens to his supporters? If you look at most data, at least 3 out of 10 of them say that they would vote for President Trump. That's a problem for the Democratic Party going into November. And again, that's why I think the president will be reelected.
Let's see who the Democrats nominate before we start worrying about Bernie
we know
Sanders
who they're going to nominate, Eleanor.
supporters.
Probably Joe Biden. Let's be honest.
Well, that's
Michael
not a problem.
Bloomberg coming up
that's
fast.
not a problem.
But do you think Bernie's supporters will turn out for him?
That was the problem in 2016. The desire to defeat Donald Trump is quite overwhelming. Right. And I just don't think you're going to see the Bernie people sitting it out because they didn't get their wish. There are some issues, I grant you that. You're not going to get every one of them, but I don't think we're looking at a 2016 problem.
Jim, do you think here with the, you mentioned that there are some senators on the Republican side who have concerns, and one of the things you sort of hear behind the scenes, that there are a lot more senators who are quite upset with Trump's conduct, but are stepping into line with him. Do you think any Republican votes will split?
I think there is a possibility. I would look really closely at Mitt Romney. Yeah. I think the fact that it hasn't happened yet suggests that it's possible it doesn't happen. all of the incentives really are, if you're a Republican senator, to side with the president. And that's why I think that the emphasis is really going to be on somebody like Romney, who not only has staked a lot of his reputation on being anti-Trump, or at least willing to challenge Trump, but is fairly safe. He represents Utah.
Right.
He's unlikely to be primaried or defeated for re-election. Senators who are retiring, who don't really have to worry about the electoral consequences or future primary challenges, might just want a flattering media profile. But the fact remains that this is a political process with just the trappings of a judicial and legal process.
It's about staying in power, and every senator is going to weigh their own re-election chances. And you could have some defections on the Democratic side, also with
you could have a Joe Manchin
or
Sinema.
Doug Jones in
Jones is up for re-election this year, so
right. But again, the message that's gotten through is 70% of the public and 64% of Republicans say we want to see the witnesses and the testimony. So again, I bring you back, asterisks next to that acquittal. It will not look, and history will not look at this as a fair process.
Especially when one of the charges is obstruction of Congress.
Exactly.
That's what we're talking about here. The process itself is being corrupted by the president.
But we're in an election year. I think the American people will have an ample amount of time to decide who they want to vote for in November, and they should be given the choice whether or not they want to remove Donald Trump. Look, I'm not happy with every single thing the president does, but I do have faith and trust in our system and the average voter to make the decisions that they believe is in their best interest and the interest of the American people writ large. And I don't think the Democratic Party should attempt to force that among voters by removing the president in the middle of an election
first
year.
of all, he's not going to get removed, but
they're trying, is my point, Eleanor.
What he did should be exposed. I mean, why they should at least censure him. I mean, maybe that might be a discussion we will have next week. He should not be allowed to get away, as he is saying, that he made a perfect call, he did nothing wrong. It is so obvious that he is guilty that's really not an issue.
And it also raises the question of if he were reelected and is a lame duck, what's keeping him to obeying the rules this time around when he's not facing election?
Okay, let's have a quick round robin here, starting with Jim. Who's the star of the first week? Are you going to say Adam Schiff? Who are you going to say?
I think you do have to say Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff was sort of their point man, and I think that Schiff, his main task was to try to answer what I think is the Republicans' best argument in this whole proceeding, which is simply let the people vote. You don't have to get into the weeds of Trump's conduct and whether it's a perfect call or not, and the details of the aid being delayed and when it was dispersed. It's a very basic and easy argument. Schiff's task, I think, was to say, of course, you can't actually have a fair election if President Trump is going to be able to do those things. I think that's a bit tendentious, but it is an effective counter-argument, I think.
I don't know, very quickly.
Clearly Adam Schiff.
Okay.
I mean, masterful explanation of the details, a moral case that he's making, and appealing to the Senate. I mean, I'm tempted to say he's our Clarence Darrow, but I know that'll get me in trouble with the right.
Well, you've said it. You've said it.
I'm going to go outside of the process and say Nancy Pelosi. I've been watching many of the public interviews she's given, and I would argue she's done a masterful job of articulating this in very simplistic, reductionist terms to the average person, specifically independent swing voters, who can say, you know what, she has a point. The president will be impeached forever. The behavior isn't good. Perhaps we should do something. And I give her credit for that.
Yes, I agree with you. I think Nancy Pelosi has shown remarkable acumen at dealing with the system, which is her job, and her depth of knowledge. I've been amused lately. I made a casual remark on this show about we ought to nominate Nancy Pelosi for president, and now I'm seeing it pop up on Twitter a lot.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go with Chief Justice Roberts, showing that the branches of American governance remain the best virtue of governance in the world. Issue 2. Davos populism.
A pro-worker, pro-citizen, pro-family agenda demonstrates how a nation can thrive when its communities, its companies, its government, and its people work together for the good of the whole nation.
Addressing the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland this week, President Trump doubled down on his guiding principle of national populism. Nations, rather than global architectures, are best placed to serve human interests, Trump said. Many others at the summit disagree. They say that concerns such as climate change can only be addressed by global action.
And Eleanor, I should clarify, that video with the music was a White House video, not my personal.
Okay.
But how do you see Davos in terms of the Trump nationalist populism versus the sort of more globalist architecture?
Well, the New York Times, one of the headlines was the Davos oligarchs flocked to Trump, and they called him the Davos man. I mean, 2 years ago, I think he was there, and he was, widely disdained. He seemed to come across like a bit of an ignorant fool in their eyes. Well, now they like the economy, they like power, they think he might be reelected. And so, again, just as the impeachment trial is all about raw power, so is Davos. And so the president knows how to play that game. He invited a number of the Davos elitists to his signing or his announcement of the trade agreement with China. And he's kind of loving the fact that the markets are doing well and says, give my best to Jamie Dimon. But there's a big cleavage there in terms of climate in particular.
Jim, how serious do you think President Trump is about shaping a legacy narrative of, a return to the nation state? And how much of this is Trump's effort to mobilize a domestic base that likes that idea?
I mean, if you go back and watch interviews with Donald Trump that date back to the 1980s, the most consistent theme of his political thought, which has evolved in a lot of different ways in other areas, is the idea that the United States is being screwed over, taken advantage of by foreign countries, by foreign governments, and that there needed to be some powerful figure elected who would put a stop to that. And Trump's election coincided with a trend of national populism throughout the Western world to varying degrees, different political parties having different degrees of success pushing that message. And I think advisors and aides close to Trump have tried to hone that political instinct, that basic instinct, and connect it to an overarching populist philosophy. And so I think there is an element of wanting a legacy, but if it's about base mobilization, Davos seems like a very strange place to do it.
Well, I would agree with you on that, except I don't agree with you on it as much now as I would have 10, 20 years ago when I was arguing with Pat Buchanan sitting in your chair about this, because that view has become more popular, even in my own hometown, a decaying factory town in southern Ohio, where the book Hillbilly Elegy originated, J.D. Vance.
And Michael, it is quite striking to Clarence's point that Senator Sanders from the Democratic left, and very opposed to free trade, very skeptical of some of this globalist architecture, is actually quite close to President Trump on that.
No, he certainly is, and I think his message of populism is not a ideologically specific term. It's a term that could arise on the ideological left as it has on the ideological right, and I think that's why you see sustenance with Senator Sanders. And look, I think it's not just individuals in the Midwest. I think if you talk about African Americans in the South who have seen globalization impact their communities, a loss of jobs as manufacturers have either moved or have decided to hire in cheaper labor south of the border. And so this is an issue that I think, regardless of race, impacts people. And so I think Sanders' message of socioeconomics, which is very similar to President Trump's early on, is a message that has sustenance and resonance regardless of race or gender, and not only in our country, but you're seeing it in South America. You're seeing it all across Europe. And this is something that I think will continue to expand as some individuals on the ideological left attempt to erase all borders. And I think a lot of people have fundamental problems with that.
I don't think Sanders would be welcome at Davos, and I don't think he'd go.
I think that's a good bet.
There's that story.
And, apologize for my coughing here, but it might be a good time to raise the coronavirus and the fear and terror it's arousing in China, where the government seems to be taking all the steps that it should, having learned from the SARS epidemic of a few years ago, cracking down. They're confining 8 million people now, and many of them are afraid to leave their homes. And we are now screening at airports, and we do have one case in this country. I would just hope that President Trump pays the same amount of attention to this that President Obama did when the Ebola virus broke out. That was successfully contained. I think this is a big challenge, and it's about globalism, frankly. So it fits into the Davos discussion.
And Jim, to Eleanor's point there, actually, with the coronavirus, isn't that a very good example of where global multilateral structures are fundamentally important to resolving an issue? That a nation state acting on that issue is not going to be able to do the kind of things that would be necessary to prevent a major epidemic.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that these things are always a zero-sum game. So there are clearly instances where you need multilateral cooperation, and the existence of institutions that facilitate that cooperation clearly is to the good. I think a lot of us, though, however, believe that some of the global institutions, some of these multilateral institutions have lost legitimacy in the eyes of the voters and constituencies that they purportedly exist to represent, and that becomes an unsustainable situation. And in some areas, the nation state is the largest political unit in which small L liberalism can thrive.
You know, I imagine you're thinking of NATO, which is a successful alliance for 70 years, kept the peace in Europe, which has a lot to do with success in this country as well. These are our allies. The president now wants this country to get out of the Middle East. He'd like NATO troops to go in there. Maybe NATO does need to be modernized. I think they're aware of that. But to shrug off these alliances is simply, you know, an anachronism of the past is a big mistake.
But Clarence, do you think, one of the challenges, though, if you look at the United Nations, massive corruption, massive inefficiency, undemocratic governance in terms of having Venezuela on the Human Rights Council, some of that stuff, why haven't we resolved that? Because you would think from a sort of more globally minded point of view, you could say to people, okay, we've reformed that, this is now get back on board.
Well, Tom, it's complicated. You know, I mean, 10, 15 years ago, we were talking about Libya being what Gaddafi was chair of that human rights board. I mean, when it gets that farcical, you know you've got a serious problem. But we got short-term and long-term considerations when you're trying to bring the whole world together, and especially the developing world, where you've got a number of governments that are right on the edge there as far as some semblance of democracy is concerned. So I think we need to be involved in the world, because the world will be involved with us no matter what. So we need to be somehow in a leadership position rather than just leading from behind, as an old phrase I haven't heard in a while.
If we didn't have a UN, we'd be saying we need it, and especially, again, I'm going to come back to climate change. That is coming upon us, and that is that's going to make the divisions within the UN even more complicated, but makes the need to muster world support to save the planet even more critical.
Sure, these alliances are important, and I think they're incredibly important now when you look at China and you look at the maneuvering that China is doing in our own backyard throughout South America, throughout the Caribbean, all across Africa. They're now in the Middle East, and what they're essentially doing with the Chinese state-owned bank to these developing nations, they're giving out billions and billions of dollars, zero interest loans, take 100 years if you need to. And what concerns me about that, Tom, is that they're essentially buying loyalty in dozens of developing countries around the world. And the question has to be, where's the United States leadership in this? If we're not leading the world, then China is. And that's a fundamental problem because it's against our interests.
An advantage we have, though, is that a lot of the corruption that sustains those relationships and poor construction quality, disregard for the rule of law. There's an advantage there. One final point I'm going to jump on here. I don't understand why more of us who are predisposed to at least alliances like NATO don't make the case that free trade, as much as it has been very bad for people, and I'm not going to pretend that's something I've suffered, has reduced marginal costs for cheap goods. You go to Walmart, you can save more money. Most people in this country manifestly benefit from being able to buy more goods, more selection at cheaper costs. Fact, in my opinion. All right, predictions, Jim.
We're going to have a Mitt Romney surprise.
Okay. Okay, Eleanor.
Ooh, I'm excited.
I'm expecting him to what?
It's a surprise.
Jim is giving himself some wiggle room there.
That's a lot of wiggle room. The president will invoke executive privilege immediately if John Bolton is called, but that's tricky because he's used it as kind of a mafia threat all along and has never once invoked it, because it would go straight to the Supreme Court. And while the president thinks he's got a conservative majority there, Justice Roberts has sat through and listened to all of this evidence. I'm not so sure he would side with the president.
Okay.
I would say watch Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary process. There's been some reporting the past several days that even President Obama is becoming increasingly concerned about Bernie Sanders and the amount of support he's building with African Americans, with Hispanic Americans who vote Democratic, and they obviously believe that he cannot win in a general election. And so back to a point I made earlier, if he doesn't get the nomination, will a lot of his ardent supporters feel once again that it was stolen from him?
Clarence.
You beat me to the punch on that one. I agree with you. I also believe we're going to see a Michael Bloomberg surprise. How about that?
Okay.
Which we're already starting to see with his polling numbers are doing remarkably well for a non-campaign TV
Good
campaign.
point.
Okay. But in lieu of a prediction, I'm simply going to say that it was a positive moment this week, the memorialization of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the Soviet Union and the United States, very different political architectures joining together to end a great evil. So there is some positivity in history and in contemporary politics. Anyway, that's enough for today. Thank you for watching. See you next time.